Welcome back, everybody. You're listening and watching the prosecution's closing arguments in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Welcome here back to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. So as we said, we are covering the Jeffrey Willis case. Jeffrey Willis was on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Herringa, a Michigan mother that disappeared from her gas station job back in April of 2013. Her body has never been found. No one knows exactly what happened to Miss Herringa, but the prosecution is saying Jeffrey Willis sure does. He kidnapped her from her gas station job, brought her back to his grandfather's abandoned house, had his way with her, and disposed of her body. Now, what we're doing right now is don't look up the verdict, ladies and gentlemen, because we have the verdict. We got it last night. Now, here's the thing. We are not going to let you know what the verdict is. We won't do it. We want to play you the entire, we want to really analyze the entire purpose of this case. We want to start with the closing arguments, and we're going to analyze this case in detail before we let you know what the verdict is. In the prosecution's closing argument, which is what we were just listening to in the beginning portion of it, the prosecutor started out by saying, look, the Jessica Herringa abduction and murder is tied to Mr. Willis in two other ways. Remember, Mr. Willis was convicted last year in the shooting death of jogger Rebecca Bletch. Evidence from that crime scene is being used now. Mr. Willis has also been implicated in trying to kidnap a teenager back in 2016. Evidence from that crime is being used now. There are certain key points of evidence from these three events that are very similar. So let's analyze what the prosecution is trying to do. And let's do that because I have a very special guest with me right now, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor David Pietro. David, great to have you back here on the program.
Having me.
So the prosecution starting off this Herringa closing argument case by saying, let's look back at the Rebecca Bletch murder. Let's look back at when Mr. Willis allegedly tried to kidnap Madison Nygaard, this teenage girl. What do you make of their stance about trying to connect these other two events to the Herringa disappearance?
Well, you know, if you can get what they call Williams rule evidence in, which is other acts that usually are not admissible unless you can intertwine it into the case on a very limited circumstance. If you can get that kind of evidence in, that evidence alone sometimes is so damning that the jury knows that this defendant is a bad guy. So if you can get that, usually this evidence is reserved for sex-related cases like the Bill Cosby case, where they brought in all the other offenders. So if you can bring this kind of evidence in, sometimes the jury is just turned off that this is a bad person, and they don't need a lot of details.
But it's more than just being a bad person here. Isn't it a pattern? So, for instance, the silver van that Mr. Willis owned, it is alleged that he used it in these three different events. He used it when he killed Rebecca Bletch, he used it when he tried to kidnap this teenager, and he used it to kidnap Jessica Herringa from her gas station job. For all of our viewers, you see the silver van right there. All of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, that's the silver van. They actually were able to track a silver van that was moving in the night in question. They were able to track it based upon cell phone evidence and video surveillance footage. They were able to track it driving northbound from the gas station to Jeffrey Willis's grandfather's house. So the silver van becomes a key point. But what about the gun? What about the gun, David?
Yeah, it all helps with the timeline of proving a case that this is not a mistake, that this is the actual person that committed a crime, and showing and intertwining it with other events. But it does help that these other events happen to be bad events. So juries usually, they don't know the defendant's in custody. They don't know he's wearing shackles. He's wearing a suit. They don't know anything, and that's the fair way to try a case. And they also don't know his criminal record for the most part, unless it's somehow admissible or other bad acts. And having other bad acts gives a jury, I believe, an easier time to render a conviction. This is not a one-time event. Well, maybe it's not really him. Maybe he's a good guy. Maybe he has family. And this is, you know, that kind of thing. It kind of intertwines him with being a bad actor. So it helps prosecution tremendously.
Well, this is an interesting case for the prosecution because they have no body. They don't really know what happened to Jessica, and Jessica's DNA was nowhere to be found in Jeffrey Willis's van or on any of the items in his van, including this rape kit that had a ball gag and restraints and all this other weird, fun stuff. Maybe that's the way to explain it. But there was none of her DNA. So what did they have to tie him? We talked about the silver van, but I want to mention the gun because this gun, it's alleged that Jeffrey Willis stole his co-worker's gun. It was a .22 Walther gun. There was a laser sight that could be fitted onto that gun. A battery cover for the battery for that laser sight was found at the Jessica Heringa crime scene. It's also alleged that that same gun was the one he used to kill Rebecca Bletch, and it's also believed that that same gun was the gun that he used to hold Madison Nygaard at gunpoint in the van. So you see how these all things are connected. Now, David, I want you to stand by. As the prosecution is tying these three events together, you heard that one of the ways they're doing this is Madison Nygaard, this teenager who says that she was almost kidnapped by Jeffrey Willis back in 2016. Well, guess what? Guess what the jury heard? Guess what the jury heard on the first day of this case? The testimony of Madison Nygaard. That's right. She took the stand and said, "This is what happened to me." Take a look. That's the prosecution's closing arguments in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. The Jeffrey Willis case. Jeffrey Willis is on trial for the murder of Jessica Heringa, a woman who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. The prosecution says that he kidnapped her from that gas station job and killed her and disposed of her body because no one knows where she is. Her body has never been found. Now, we're analyzing this case in its entirety, even though we have the verdict. That's right, we have the verdict. We got it yesterday. We will let you know what the verdict is later on in the program. But we're analyzing this case. I want to bring on right now criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor David Pietro. David, you're listening to the prosecution's closing arguments. Our listeners, our viewers were just watching it. How on earth, you're a great defense attorney. How do you defend this in the sense that Jeffrey Willis had a laundry list? Let me rephrase. Let's back up. His computer had a ton of murder, rape, mutilation, kidnapping videos on it. It had evidence of Jessica Heringa's, there were Jessica Heringa photos on it. There was a folder in there that's titled Vix with her name on it. Mr. Willis, outside of his grandfather's house, there was a crumpled note with a laundry list of items, including things like ball gags, gas can, leather restraints, vibrator, insulin injections, all this kind of stuff you would need to kidnap somebody, incapacitate them, murder them, and dispose of their body. And then finally, he admitted, Mr. Willis admitted that he would videotape young girls at swim meets. How do you defend this behavior if you're his defense counsel?
Oh, it's not easy. I mean, that's a pretty damning characteristic of somebody's mental thoughts that are very deviant. I think you focus on the lack of evidence, and that's that the body was never found, and you focus on that. You really just try to divert, because you only need to get the jury to hang on one thing. You don't need to prove that your guy's a great guy, a wonderful person. All you got to do is create that reasonable doubt, and you got to find that lack of evidence and hammer it home, and basically concede or ignore that evidence because it's not favorable. It's quite damning from a characteristic standpoint.
Dave, you make a good point. It's an uphill battle, but then again, like you said, there's no body and there's no DNA evidence linking Jeffrey Willis to Jessica Heringa. We'll play you the defense's closing argument later on in the program, and we'll let you know later if it worked. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We are following the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. This is the case that we've been focused on for the past, I would say, week or so. This has been an amazing case to watch, a really unbelievable set of circumstances and details. Jeffrey Willis is a convicted murderer. He was convicted last year in the shooting death of Rebecca Bletch, but we're covering him a second time here in the trial of the murder of Jessica Heringa, a Michigan mother that disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. Despite the fact her body has never been found, the prosecution has moved forward with their case against Mr. Willis, and it is an entirely circumstantial evidence case because there is no direct evidence linking Jeffrey Willis to Jessica Heringa. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but no DNA, no definitive eyewitnesses, nothing yet. But this has been an interesting back and forth. Now, as I keep telling you, we have the verdict. We have the verdict in this case, and we will let you know what that verdict is. But later on in the program, we are analyzing this case in its entirety. What we're doing is playing for you the prosecution's closing argument, and then we're going to play for you the defense's closing argument. Before our last break, the prosecution was talking about what was found on Jeffrey Willis's computer. Now, who better to talk about that then Gerald McCarthy, a witness in this case that examined Jeffrey Willis's computer. And this is what he said. In all of his experience, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but this is basically what he said, I have never seen this amount of a certain types of videos on one device in my life. He's never seen anything like this before. This is the testimony of Gerald McCarthy. Listen up, it's really disturbing. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We were playing for you some testimony in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a man who is on trial for the abduction and murder of Jessica Heringa, a Michigan mother that disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. And that was the last time she was ever seen again. No one knows what happened to her, but they're saying Jeffrey Willis sure does. That was the testimony of Gerald McCarthy. He's a computer expert who analyzed the defendant's computer. And what did he find on there? He found numerous amounts of murder, torture, rape, kidnapping videos. And as he was saying, he found all these videos and images of young girls. Mr. Willis admitted to taking images of videos of young girls at swim meets. So all of these interesting things were found on here. I want to bring back in David Pietro. David, not only is the disturbing amount of content on here interesting, but I'm wondering, I'm sitting here, let's say I'm a juror. What does this mean? How does this tie to the Jessica Heringa disappearance? Well, why were there photos of her on his computer? Why was that folder created after her disappearance? And why was the password to that computer her initials with the date she died, she disappeared, excuse me? Why? How does the defense explain that? If he had no connection, they seem to be saying, or at least what we heard in his first trial, oh, he just wanted a collection of information about her to ultimately help the police. What do you make of that?
Well, the forensics can determine the timing of when that information was stored. It's completely damning evidence, although the prosecutor doesn't need to prove motive. But when you have a lack of a body and a lack of a DNA, motive is important, so is elimination of mistake, meaning this is not the wrong guy. So I think this is great probative evidence for the prosecution, and intertwining that this was the only individual, and here's additional evidence to pile on that he was the actual, the person that committed the crime. Yeah.
Quick, we have 10 seconds real quick. The fact that this folder was created after Jessica disappeared as opposed to before, does that mean that he didn't plan it? What does that let the jurors know?
Either he's a deviant and he's just following his own crimes, like he's fascinated with it, or the defense could play it, intertwine it as to evidence that shows that it has really no relevance to the crime.
And that's the amazing thing about this case. You can look at certain facts and they could go certain ways. I love those kinds of cases where you really can look at things and you could hear it from the defense's perspective, you can hear it from the prosecution's perspective. Now, I want to let everybody know we have the verdict in the Jeffrey Willis case, and we will let you know what that verdict is later on in the program. But there's a lot more to discuss. We'll be back in a minute. That's the prosecution's closing argument in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. As I said, we are covering the Jeffrey Willis case, this man who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Heringa, a woman who disappeared from her gas station job back in April of 2013. She's never been seen since. Her body has never been found. But the prosecution is saying that Jeffrey Willis kidnapped her, killed her, and disposed of her. What you just heard in the prosecution's closing argument was a couple of things. First, talking about what was on Jeffrey Willis's computer, that it had a list of all of the people that he may have had something to do with. So first, there's information about Rebecca Bletch, who we know he was convicted of killing back in 2014. There's information about Jessica Heringa, who again he's on trial for, disappeared back in 2013. That's alleged that he killed her. But there was nothing about Madison Nygaard, this teenager who alleges that Jeffrey Willis tried to kidnap her back in 2016, but he was unsuccessful. Then you heard a little bit about the testimony of Susan Follett, who was the eyewitness that night that Jessica disappeared. She worked with Jessica. She was a co-worker at the ExxonMobil gas station. She drove by that night, wasn't working, drove by on her motorcycle in the 11 p.m. hour, and saw a mysterious silver van driven by a mysterious individual who went to that gas station, was there for a few moments, and drove away. It is alleged that that was Jeffrey Willis, and in that van was Jessica Herringa. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor David Pietro. David, first point, the fact that this is, as the prosecutor said, this is his live trophy, this is his digital trophy case, what's on his computer. So he has information about these two women, but he has nothing about Madison Nygaard. And as he said, as I always tell my children, you don't get a trophy until you accomplish the mission. Is there any validity in that statement?
Oh, absolutely. I love the whole chart and mapping it all out from a digital effect. I mean, it's really damning evidence, and the trophy is the killing. So I think it was a great tie-in. I think it was a great closing argument.
And as we keep saying, since there's no body, there's no DNA, they're trying to work with whatever circumstantial evidence they have. Now, David, one of the biggest pieces of evidence and one of the most crucial witnesses was Susan Follett. As I said, this woman that worked with the victim, drove by that night and saw this mysterious silver van driven by this mysterious individual. What did you make of her testimony? Because she really is she and her husband are the prime, I want to say, eyewitnesses to maybe a potential abduction. What did you make of her entire testimony, which we're about to play for our listeners and our viewers?
It's perfect for the timeline for the prosecution. They're placing the defendant in the location of when the crime began, and putting two normal people on the stand that are credible. I think it helps in tying and putting the whole time and factual scenario together for the jury to understand, for it all to make sense.
And it's interesting when she begins to identify him, because if anybody who's been watching our case, watching the Jeffrey Willis case, Jeffrey Willis is a slender-looking guy with medium-length hair and a long beard. But back in 2013, he weighed almost 300 pounds. Well, his wife said he weighed almost 300 pounds. His hair was much shorter. He had potentially blonde highlights during the time Jessica disappeared. And his facial hair, either was clean-shaven or a very, very, very trimmed facial hair. Well, guess what? Susan Follett, the eyewitness, describes someone very similar to that description as the person driving that van. We have her testimony from earlier in the case. Let's play that now.
So you see the light.
That's the emotional testimony of Susan Follett in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Jeffrey Willis is on trial for the abduction and murder of Jessica Herringa, a gas station clerk that went missing from her job back in 2013. Her body has never been found. So, as you just heard from the testimony of Susan Follett, the night that Jessica disappeared, she worked with Jessica. She wasn't working that night, but she drove by the ExxonMobil gas station and she saw the silver van. We know that Jeffrey Willis owns a silver van that was maybe driven by Jeffrey Willis, come into the gas station and then leave. It's alleged that that is when Jeffrey Willis kidnapped this young mother. What we're going to do now, so that was Susan Follett's actual testimony. Listen to how the prosecution in their closing argument, took that Susan Follett's testimony and really built it into an argument to describe what Jeffrey Willis looked like in the night in question. Let's play that for you right now. That's the prosecution's closing argument in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, here on the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Jeffrey Willis on trial for the murder of Jessica Herringa. It's alleged that he kidnapped her from her gas station job back in April of 2013 because her body has never been found. No one has ever seen her since she was working that night. But the prosecution is saying he did it. He killed her, he took her, he killed her, he disposed of her body. I want to bring back on David Pietro. David, you're listening to the prosecution's closing argument when they're talking about what Jeffrey Willis looked like the night in question. Now, this becomes a difficult issue because, first of all, Jeffrey Willis today doesn't look like how he looked in the past. He was 300 pounds back in the past. He's much skinnier now. He has a fuller beard, thicker hair, no blonde highlights. That is an important issue, the identity, because what we're talking about, what you heard from the testimony of Susan Follett, in which the prosecution just explained, was that the person that showed up to that ExxonMobil gas station in the 11 p.m. hour when they believed Jessica was taken had blonde highlights, almost no beard, clean-shaven. But when you listen to these different witnesses, they can say, oh, you know what, Mr. Willis did have blonde highlights, he had shorter beard, but they couldn't positively confirm that it was exactly April 2013. It might have been a different month, it might have been later on. That becomes a big issue for the jury, correct?
It could, yeah. One of the most crucial things that a prosecutor must prove is that a crime was committed and the person that they're charging is the person, or that they're trying is the person that committed the crime. So identification, if you can't positively identify somebody either directly or through circumstantial evidence, you could get a directed verdict. I mean, the whole case could go down the drain.
Especially when you don't have a body. They need something to tie him to there. So just saying a guy with a silver van, whom maybe or maybe not Jeffrey Willis, when Susan Follow, the eyewitness to this, was a further step back. She wasn't so close to identify him.
Correct. Yeah, so this is important for the prosecution to tie it up that, the change, the fact that the jail food isn't that good and he's lost some weight and his change in appearance, it's still the same person. So I think it gives the defense something to argue. I mean, this is probably why he didn't take the stand, because obviously it would that would alleviate a lot of arguments on this is not the person who committed the actual crime.
David, you said it right. Jeffrey Willis did not take the stand. The case is rested, and we have a verdict in the Jeffrey Willis case, but I'm not going to let anybody know what it is just yet. We're going to let them know later on in the program once we analyze this case in its entirety. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about what evidence was found at the Jessica Heringa crime scene. And let me tell you, it really connects Jeffrey Willis to this disappearance. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Thank you for joining us. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case right now. Jeffrey Willis out of Michigan, a convicted murderer who's back in the courtroom, this time for a second time here on the Law and Crime Network. We're covering him. His second trial right now is the Jessica Heringa disappearance and murder. It's alleged that he kidnapped her from her ExxonMobil gas station job back in April of 2013, took her back to his grandfather's abandoned house, killed her, had his way with her, and disposed of her body, because her body has never been found. Now, I want to bring back in David Pietro. David, we've been playing the prosecution's closing arguments for our audience. We're trying to analyze this case in its entirety. Before we let you go, I do have to ask you a very important question about this case. When we covered Jeffrey Willis the first time, when he was on trial for the murder of Rebecca Blech, he took the stand. He tried to explain all of his actions, why he had certain things on his computer, what he was doing the day in question, everything about him. He didn't take the stand in this case. Now, again, for anybody who's just joining us, we have the verdict in this case, but we're not going to let you know until later on in the program. So we're analyzing this case in its entirety. The fact that Mr. Willis did not take the stand in this case, even though he did in the first, why do you think he didn't do that?
Because there's absence of evidence, there's absence of DNA, there's absence of a body, and there's absence of identification. So it gives great arguments in closing that he would have to be confronted by the prosecutors with, which would tie that all together, that it was him. So it was probably a smart move not to testify.
Well, we'll have to see if it paid off when we render the verdict, or not render the verdict, when we deliver the verdict and tell you what the verdict is later on in the program. David, thank you so much for joining us here.
Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
You too. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to continue playing for you the prosecution's closing argument. What the prosecutor moved on to next in his closing argument, and we've been playing it for you at the beginning of the program, this is when he moves into what other evidence was collected at the Jessica Heringa crime scene. I'm talking about the gas station job. That was the last place she was ever seen again. Listen very carefully to what was found at the crime scene and how they believe that connects Jeffrey Willis to her disappearance. Take a look.